You aren't familiar with us, a bit about ourselves first. So we're a company called calQurisk. Most of our backgrounds are in risk and compliance, so we've all been there and done that in terms of trying to get systems and frameworks and everything else set up. We offer governance, risk and compliance software solutions and services. We're headquartered here in Ireland, and our client base is right across Ireland, the UK, and further afield, usually in sectors like fund management, insurance, payments, and lots more. And today we're going to focus on, as I mentioned, the Digital Operation Resilience Act and the lessons learned around that. So we have a couple of different things on the agenda that we just wanted to focus on. So maybe Jerry, if you want to pop over to the next slide of just what we're going to touch on this morning.
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, no problem. So as I did, we'll pass on the introductions, lessons learned from the register information. So that's where we'll ask Nina and Hugh their own kind of feedback and opinions on how they got there really with the register of information. And Jerry will also touch on maybe some of the more technical errors that we kind of stumbled across and our users will have stumbled across as well. Once we're done with that piece, then we'll have a look at the wider DORA compliance obligations. So back to those 5 pillars, which we all would have started to think and talk about all that time ago. And then we'll just briefly touch on kind of what's next and what some of the noises there that are coming from the national competent authorities around both the register of information, but also the other compliance obligations, which we'll touch on. So I think we'll pass over then for introductions. So my name is Chris and I'm the CEO here with calQurisk. I'm joined by my colleague Jerry, who I'll let introduce himself now, and then we'll pass to Nina and Hugh as well.
Hi, Jerry Joyce. I'm one of the co-founders of calQurisk and CTO. Thank you. Nina.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jerry. Hi, my name is Nina Fagan. I'm the head of outsourcing at SMT Fund Services.
Hello, my name is Hugh Smith and I'm the head of operational governance and resilience at Arachas Corporate Brokers Limited.
Excellent. And thanks again to Nina and Hugh for joining us this morning as well and giving their opinions on everything DORA related. So just before we pass over to Jerry for some of the feedback on the actual submission of the register information and some of the errors we might have came across, I just wanted to very briefly just pop up a poll, if that's okay with everyone. There were lots of maybe teething issues that people had with the register of information. I just wanted to ask the audience as well, how many times did you have to submit the register of information before it was accepted? And the numbers will range wildly, I think. We've come across people who got it in quite a low number, and then we've come across people who maybe had to tweak and change a lot. And a lot of it seems to have maybe even depended on what competent authority you were reporting into about how long the portal and things like that were open as well. So I think we have a lot of votes in there now at the minute. So I'm just going to end the poll now. And sorry, they're still trickling in. Just bear with me 2 seconds. Lovely. I'll end the poll now, and I think we can share the results. So I think you can see there's two. Well, a lot of people were kind of caught with having 20+ submissions as well, which I'm sure was a bit of a pain point, and hopefully that becomes a bit smoother as well with the second and third round of submissions and things like that as it becomes part of the business as usual. And then quite a few firms were lucky enough to actually get in a manageable or a reasonable number as well in that 1 to 5 bracket or 1 to 5 bucket too, which I think is quite impressive, given just how technical the submission was. And I think speaking about how technical the submission was, I might just pass over to Jerry now as well, and we'll chat through some of those pieces that we've come across.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it was deciding what to leave out of this screen, but the way I saw it is there were like two fences to jump. The first one was the local competent authority, and everybody's waiting for that, accepted screen. But in the beginning, I would say there are error messages on the guide that are, I would say the language is clear what the problem is. But it was the ones where the error messages maybe were unclear, like object reference not set to an instance of the object, which kind of threw people. And that one actually was, if you had a capital C in a column instead of a lowercase c, that's what that meant. That's the message you would get. And that's the case sensitivity that was that caught a few people as well. That the file names had to be in lowercase b, and the filing indicators showing the list of files attached, that had to be in uppercase b. So that inconsistency annoyed, I would say. And the third one, and again that because this was gone into CBI even before the file was accepted, was the UTF-8 format. And what we learned was there are different UTF-8 formats. And the cleanest, I guess, is when you write something in Notepad. But if you're coming from Excel and you export, you have to remove all the Excel extra characters. But so that caught a few people. But once past that, then there was peace and quiet for a few weeks in the middle of April and up to the end of April, until it went to the EBA, and then they start coming back rejected again. And a second poll would have been interesting here. How many got rejection? But I reckon that the rejection from the EBA was probably closer to the 100%, particularly because they had a lot of wrongly flagged errors. And this is extraordinary that after the dry run testing and everything else, that they would wrongly flag errors. Now, they put their hands up and they fixed it. I'd say by the first week in May, they were fixed. After that, then, most of the ones we saw, and I've picked out 3 or 4 here, error 806, that was duplicates, that if you had several contracts with a third party, then there were certain tables, they only wanted one contract in there and didn't want to see the others, because you were, in their own language, you cannot have multiple rows with identical key values. 807 was a little bit trickier because the language said, the reported data must follow key foreign key constraints defined in the data model. What does foreign key mean? In layman's terms, in normal English, it's a reference. It's a reference to another table. And one example that caught a few people is that if you put in a third party that their ultimate parent, LEI or EUID was this, they actually had to be in that table as well, even though they mightn't have been a third party. Well, a lot of them weren't. They were just the ultimate parent, but they had to be listed as a record in there, because there's a little dotted line in the table that from 110 back to 10 to say you have to be referencing something that is somewhere else in the same table. But we got over them, and I'm happy to say that all are now past the second hurdle. LEI, there were a few that came back with the LEI that you picked for a supplier was maybe invalid, and when you checked on the database, it came up the status as invalid, and those were rejected. But they were kind of self-explanatory, I guess. What annoyed a lot of people was the differences between the ITS and the FAQ. Now, the ITS might have said you can leave something blank or empty, and the FAQ said, no, you got to put in not applicable or something. So there's but again, if you had read the FAQ, and I would say you take the FAQ as the latest document, but there were differences. So that's, I would say my summary. One thing I would say is that I like to think we handled very well was in the dry run on December the 18th, I think they said that 86% of rejections in the dry run were due to missing information. Well, I'm happy to say that we put in some validation where we checked for that information was present. And I'm happy to say that the errors we saw, there was very few in terms of missing information. So I'm going to ask Nina now to, if I haven't stolen your thunder, but maybe give us a few minutes on your experience on register. Submitting the register of
my
information.
experience, it was a very, thanks Jerry, it was a very interesting experience, a very interesting time. It was a very short window between the Tuesday and the Friday in April, 1st and the 4th of April. I don't think I'll ever forget 4:15 on the 4th of April, Jerry, thanks to you and the support of calQrisk, that we managed to get the register of information across the line. It was very, very challenging for a number of reasons. So initially, I suppose it was gathering the information to put into calQrisk, which was obviously, a substantial piece of information across outsource providers and vendors. And that took a good bit of time to complete. We thought that was kind of where the challenge would end. But obviously then came the technical side of submitting the register of information. So I don't know about everybody else, but I found it very, very challenging that there was so much documentation, like exactly what Jerry said there. The ITS and the frequently asked questions didn't match. There's loads of lessons to be learned from the submission. I suppose for myself, the key was once we had it submitted to, document everything that we did in order to successfully submit. We had great support from calQrisk. There was also a working group set up where people were sharing the information as to what was successful for things like object of an object. I can't remember it offhand, Jerry. I know you mentioned it there, but how people successfully got their submissions across the line, and how we all worked together to make sure that we could help anybody along the way who was having difficulty. The technical aspect of it also was very challenging, because a lot of people who were submitting the registers would be in kind of second line oversight risk roles. So that was all new to me, and very much a learning curve. So I'll stop there and let Hugh jump in.
Yeah, like very, very similarly. We had taken part in the dry run exercise, and it was almost like we followed one process to do the dry run exercise, and then a couple of months later, coming out of it feeling pretty comfortable. It was like, no, all these changes have been happening. There was I wouldn't have a background in IT or XBRL or any of that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of dependency on Jerry on calQrisk to help us out when I suppose the output wasn't matching what the expectations was the first time, and then the second time, and then the third time. So it was a very steep learning curve for myself personally on getting it across the board. But I would have seen the ROI report as a final output, from other steps that we had to take within DORA. We wouldn't have been able to do that report if we hadn't have done the business impact assessment across the different areas of the business to find out those dependencies, to chase down contracts that were not all in one location, and start thinking about how do we govern the management of these third parties in a different way. And even now that continues on into, okay, well, how do we come up with a due diligence questionnaire to get to assess those risks that we've identified, to assess like anyone who works in insurance intermediaries knows that some of your third party providers you depend a lot on, and if they go down, what do you do? So it all kind of links in with the report, I suppose, being a useful piece of information for the EBA that we can generate now very easily through calQrisk.
That's great, Hugh. Yeah. And then Hugh and Nina, like if we park the technical aspect of it, how did you find that initial kind of both of you mentioned about like the quantity of information that's probably required just to even build the report, and having to reach out to kind of third-party vendors and things like that. How did you find that process of actually trying to source all the information, if that makes sense? I'd imagine it's kind of a cross team function or cross team work stream.
Yeah, it was another challenge, Chris. Like I think initially, we had an awful lot of the information in-house, right? But the challenge is that the information was across multiple teams. So it was actually pulling together that information and inputting it into calQrisk. Now, obviously, we have all that information in there now, but we also had to reach out to outsourced service providers and vendors to obtain additional information. And we had a lot of challenges with things like LEI codes, or getting the correct parent company in there. It was very small. It just took time, and was very kind of small steps. You didn't really appreciate the magnitude of how much information had to be collated from so many different sources and put into the register of information. But look, it is all going in the right direction, and obtaining this oversight. We had a great amount of oversight in place, but obviously additional oversight.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like, you know, the search for LEIs and EUIDs and ones that were, you know, acceptable to the EBA. You know, we were going on to US firms' corporate websites, getting the LEI number that they publish up there, and it wasn't being accepted for some strange reason. I don't I don't know why. Is this so? It was like a case. Okay, well, do we just, you know, pretend this company doesn't have an ultimate parent to get it across the line? You know.
Yeah. I think a lot of firms were like that in the last kind of minutes and hours of like, yeah, looking for workarounds and things like that. Hugh, you specifically mentioned that the business impact analysis piece there, and I know we might touch on this as part of the ongoing DORA compliance obligations, but how useful was it to have that piece done in advance of like actually collating all of the information and kind of trying to source everything?
Absolutely. Like, you have to work at it from the point of view of the interaction with the client, and you know, whether that's the phone call or whatever, you know, and you work at it from there. I think that if we had just started with, okay, well, who are our third parties, and go straight to IT, it would have been a much more confusing process. Whereas working with the business impact assessments, getting those dependencies, you know, working out what your critical business functions or important business services, whatever we call them this week, are, you know, and working from that perspective, it made the, uh, you know, the population of the process mapping area and the third party area much easier for us.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah. And there's just a question that popped in here now, and it's not without putting Nina or Hugh on the spot, but how did you solve any LEI issues that you had? I think maybe Hugh, you had that
No
specific
comment.
example of.
Um,
Yeah.
I think, well, I think we only had one or two issues with the LAI, and then we put in was it the CRN number or the CRO number? I can't remember which one it
Yeah.
was. Yeah, so we just had to go for the alternative because, you know, some of them very obviously didn't have LEI codes. You know, and in the interest of time, I know you can reach out to the provider and suggest but suggest that they create an LEI code, and it costs, you know, a minimal amount of money. But that's the route we went down. We just went with the C or O number. I think it was a CRN number.
Yeah. And I suppose the hope is that next time around everyone has an LEI number after pressure being applied and things like that, and people probably appreciate the need to have it and stuff like that too, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thanks for the insights there, Nina and Hugh. I think what we'll do next is we're just going to focus on the wider DORA obligations and probably kind of bring it back to those 5 pillars that, as you know, when we started thinking and talking about DORA internally, we were very much focused on the 5 pillars. So being ICT risk management and the fundamentals around that, the managing of ICT third-party risk and the register information associated with that, the major ICT-related incident piece and all the reporting obligations that unfortunately come with that, the resilience testing, and then the voluntary pillar around information sharing arrangements. So maybe pass it back over to you, Jerry, to take us through a couple of slides, just touching on that DORA isn't just a register of information, if that makes sense, which so many of us have been focused on over the last few months, that there is much more to it than just the register for now.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. The color here, I'm following the color guideline in NIST too, but it doesn't mean anything else. Okay. ICT risk management, I guess, like all good risk management, it depends on good governance. And what I noted in the, I suppose in the RTS and in the whole DORA Act, there is a strong emphasis in governance across the board. And that's, you know, from the board level down, that there are people responsible, that there are policies, there are procedures, there are protocols, and there's measurements and reporting and all of that good stuff. But interesting, I think this one follows broadly the NIST 2 framework for ICT risk management, or if you like, information security, which has been around a long time. And I was thinking, you know, there's 2 key standards out there, 27001, and I would say the NIST 2. Now, you can be accredited to 27001. NIST 2 is more of a, I like NIST 2 because it describes the outcomes you want to achieve, and you can decide how you achieve them. But if you are following one of those, then you're probably, I'm going to say 90% of the way there, in terms of having a framework for ICT risk management. The RTS on this is about 182 pages. Now, half of that is feedback from consultation. But I reckon if you're already following a standard, you're probably in a good place. But where I think a lot of organizations fall down is on the governance side, because I think certainly 27001, I would say, was light on the governance side. Yes, have a lot of policies and procedures, but that's part of governance and part of the framework. Now, managing third-party risk, even though it's a separate pillar, it actually is, let's say in the first line in it, to manage it within the ICT risk management framework. So it's a subset, if you wish, but it's an important subset, obviously, because of the dependency on third parties. Now, if you forget DORA for a moment and just think, most of us have third parties we depend upon, and third parties are an extension of your organization. And you can't just throw the parcel over the wall and assume that it's managed well. No, I mean, if anything DORA has shown us is there's a lot of questions you need to be asking, a lot of due diligence you need to be doing. And I would say if you're going to outsource to third parties or going to be dependent on third parties, and there's a subtle difference there. If you outsource the service, and certainly the Irish regulator CBI have a separate report that they want, which is to do with the outsourced service providers. But if you're dependent on a third party, then you have to manage them. You have to understand and know that the security in their organization is as good as yours. We know of plenty of cyber attacks, for example, that have come in through the third party because their defenses weren't as good as your own. So make sure they're as good as yours. You can see the register of information was just, again, a subset of the third-party risk management. But what I'm hearing today and have heard before is the exercise of doing the register of information has, and maybe the regulator knew this, has caused organizations to do some of the things that maybe were on the nice to do, but they've now done them, and they've a full understanding, a better understanding of the third parties and their dependencies and what would happen if the third party was impacted and you couldn't deliver service to your customers. I'm hearing from others, not just from Nina and Hugh, and I would say that contractual arrangements have probably been reviewed and will be reviewed over the next couple of years as they come up for renewal to address the items that maybe weren't in the contracts that were drawn up maybe 5 or even 10 years ago. There's a particular emphasis on auditors having the skills, whether they're internal auditors or external, but particularly internal auditors have the skills to assess information security risk. And I'm not saying that auditors don't naturally have this, but IT has become incredibly complex over particularly the last 10 years. And certainly to audit it requires, I would say, an IT person, and it has to be obviously a person who's independent to assess it. So yeah, there's, would you have seen this in the register of information with the strong rights of termination? They want to know, what's the notice period on your side and what's the notice period on the other side? And do you have an exit strategy if the third party says we're getting out of this business? Have you got a plan to take off the shelf and go and find somebody else? So yeah, lots of work to do there, I think.
And Jerry, just
Chris,
on that piece
yeah.
as well, I think you alluded to it in the third party on that slide as well. Were there benefits, and maybe opening it up to Nina and Hugh, of actually doing the register of information as well? I know it's been such a slog on so many people that we probably all look at it through a negative lens, but now that it's maybe, well, hopefully done, if that makes sense, and that we don't go through another round of feedback and submissions, do any of the three of you feel like that there's been a benefit to actually like collating all of this information? Has it benefited like the risk function or the oversight function or the second line function or whatever it might be in the business?
Yeah, sorry, go on. No, you go ahead.
I would say that, definitely, the BIA, the process mapping, all the stuff that I had to do in order to generate the ROI is definitely of benefit. I wouldn't be presenting an ROI to my executive management team or board to try and demonstrate the third party risk that's there. I'll have to work with Jerry on generating a simpler, less columned report for that purposes. But again, we're on the 10th of June. Like, we did our BIAs in the first week of July last year to kick this whole thing off. So we'll be prepping now to run those BIAs, the annual BIAs, and then you're into getting your critical business functions and your BCP approved again. What it definitely did bring to us was the need for proper governance, whether that's your procurement officer or whoever, of third-party contracts, to have a third-party management procedure policy in place. That's definitely what this entire process, the third-party management bit of it, anyways, has brought clear to me.
Yeah, and I agree everything you said there, Hugh. But I also think, in relation to the business owners or the first line, it's also brought back, or reinforced the how important the oversight and governance of the third party providers is. And everything now is housed in one place. Now there will be, obviously, DORA isn't going anywhere, so we'll be building upon it. But it's definitely increased awareness across the business.
And can I add a comment? Thanks, Nina. Hugh. What I've seen in one or two cases that, and certainly in the standard, that if you're going to outsource, I mean, that's the second line here, the adopt and review a strategy, and I kind of went straight into register information, but when do you outsource and what do you outsource and how, and that decision up front, if you like, a strategic decision as to what would you consider for outsourcing and what would you never outsource. And I think those decisions have to be, and that policy, if you like, that approach, strategy, whatever you want to call it, that has to be strong in the organization. So that from a very high level up, starting at the high level, certain things will never be outsourced, or certain things can be outsourced. And if they are, then the conditions under which they will be outsourced. And I think that came through as well, that requirement. Again, that's governance, isn't it? Good governance.
Absolutely, yeah. And Jerry, maybe a question then, without putting you on the spot again, but aimed at yourself. And I think you mentioned it on the third-party risk piece, and it brought back to a conversation I had with a director of, I think he was director of IT security recently, and they've 4 different regulated entities, one in Ireland, one in London, one in Luxembourg, and I think one in Germany. And he was saying they're almost exhausted of having all these local IT security guidelines, and now DORA is another piece on top of it. But you mentioned things like NIST and ISO 27001. Are you seeing like broad alignment with things like NIST or local regulators or standards now starting to kind of align, as opposed to them feeling it's 10 different rules and regulations, if that makes sense?
That's a good question. And I know, Chris, about 9 months ago, we did a webinar on DORA, and I remember reading and then confirming for myself that what DORA attempted to do, and could argue whether it did this well, I think it did a reasonably good job of looking at all the guidelines that were out there. I certainly recognized language in it from 27001, from NIST, and from other guidelines from Central Bank on cross-industry guidance on information security. And what they attempted to do in DORA in the Act was to bring all of that into one place and harmonize the guidelines, so that whether you're in Germany or Luxembourg or Dublin, that it wasn't a different standard. It wasn't, and it was consistent. So the Act meant it was the same in every country, but I think they also did pull the best from all of these guidelines. I think if you comply with DORA, you're complying with an awful lot of other guidelines. So yeah, my bottom line, I would say they have pulled it all together, and so you can have one guideline, would be my feeling. There, I've nailed my colours to the mast there.
Nice, and it's recorded too, so you're stuck now.
Okay. Incident related management. If I'll just move on. Another pillar of DORA, record incidents. Now, my question to everybody here is, why wouldn't you record incidents? Incidents are intelligence. They're early warnings. You know, how many times has something big happened and people have said, well, we should have seen that coming. And you ask why, and you say, well, because that and that happened. In my personal experience, most big incidents have been preceded by warning signs. And we call them warning signs, but why not record the small incidents? Michael Barnier, who wrote a book on ICT risk management and banking after the banking crisis in 2008. And I'll summarize his book by saying if the big banks had been recording incidents, they would have spotted this going on long before it happened. And the ones who did, like I think Goldman Sachs, they started getting out of the prime market. Why? Because they had seen the early warning signs. So I'm trying to encourage people, record your incidents, no matter how small. Now, clearly the regulator wants you to record them, and they're not looking for a report at the end of the month. But if you have a big one, if you have a major incident, here's a miniature screenshot of the 76 fields of information that you need to record. Yeah, we put a template into the product to be able to record these. Now, you would hope that you never have to record all of this information. But if the first time you're looking at what do I need to record is when you have a major incident, then you're already too late, because there's timelines that you have to adhere to and get in the initial report and then the intermediate report and then the final report. I think it's instructive to look at all of the information that might be required in a major incident to decide, well, what do I put in the normal instance? Because it's a lot less, you'd be pleased to know, but it will inform any design of any incident recording that you might want to do. As Chris says, you know, there have been, well, he will tell you later, he'll have some information on that, on the stories so far. Now, the last one here is a may. You don't have to, but you may notify the authority of significant threats. And I think what they're trying to do, obviously, is if they've contacts with hundreds of regulated firms and there's something happening out there in the ether, some particular attack from a nation state, you're the early warning indicators for the regulator and spread that through. So share the knowledge, share the information. And indeed, that is one of the pillars as well. Chris, I don't know if you had any question on that for me.
Yeah, just on the incident management piece, yeah, we can kind of see that I suppose that the competent authorities or ESAs are probably trying to get a feel for, look, we have obviously the register information now, and we know what critical third parties underpin the financial services kind of system, but I wonder about, is there any opinions on the incident management process, and do people share the same sentiment internally, if that makes sense, around the incident management process? To me, the form looks incredibly detailed, and do people see it as another register type thing, or is it a business value driver, if that makes sense again? So like Jerry, you alluded to, there's good value in logging incidents and using them as early warning indicators or key risk indicators or control failures or whatever it might be, but the form on the top right corner looks incredibly detailed. I'm not sure there's anyone in the panel any opinions on, is it going to drive value, or do you feel like it's a regulatory hurdle again?
What I would say is, why use 20 columns when you can use 70 columns? Like it's important that incidents are recorded. There is the whole classification assessment that needs to go on. I know we ourselves have integrated that into our whole BCM process. So when we're running scenario tests now in a couple of months, hopefully, we will be, if there is an IT impact, we will be running the classification assessment, and if necessary, introducing people to this form. It should be of value, but I don't know whether there'll be a case of where you had like what you had with the data breaches, where there'll be over reporting, and then there'll be like instructions coming from regulators playing, oh, please don't report all this stuff to us, you know.
Completely,
So
yeah.
it, you know, yet to see, I suppose.
Yeah,
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
yeah, Chris, and similarly with ourselves, like there is an awful lot of information captured within the incident management template or the fields required to populate the report to send to the authority. But I suppose again, it's a learning curve of how much information they're actually looking for. Now I know internally we have a monthly overview of ICT incidents since this was introduced the 17th of January. So again, it's all going in the right direction, increasing awareness. As Hugh says, 74 fields is a lot, but you know, a lot of the information is easy to obtain and put in. And I don't think the expectation is that, like, you know, a junior member of staff would be completing this to be submitted to the competent authority. I think it's you know, a senior member of staff, the you know, the say somebody from operations, etc., would start to fill out the template, but you know, would have support from seniors or the second line.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah, yeah. Which should make life a bit easier, and hopefully the submission is a bit easier as well than the actual register itself as well in terms of reference checks and data checks and things like that. So, but yeah, maybe back over to you, to yourself, Jerry.
Okay, the fourth pillar is testing, resilience testing. And I would say, again, from personal experience, that unless you test a plan, you don't know if it's going to work, and chances are a 50% chance it will fail. So do testing if only to prove your plans will work. But it's not just one testing, it's not just pen testing or vulnerability scanning. Yes, you need to do those. There's quite a range of tests that the regulator lists in the DORA Act. Hugh referred to a scenario analysis, a scenario exercise. These are very powerful ones where you arrange a scenario, maybe sit as a group of senior people, different teams, IT team, maybe the operations team, maybe the senior leadership team, and imagine, you know, it's 11:30 on Wednesday evening. And by the way, the attackers, if you're going to have a cyber attack, it won't be at 2:30. It'd probably be at 11:30 at night, usually. And somebody is working late and clicks on a dodgy link, then what? And you can imagine a scenario like that, talk it through over about 2 hours, and you will learn a lot. You will learn a lot about your own response and whether your response plan works. But that's one. They want, the regulator wants, and I would suggest you do other things as well. Like it doesn't have to be a cyber attack. What if the marketing department have a successful advert and you get 100 times as many inquiries on your website as you normally get? You know, would a sudden increase in activity cause your systems to fall over? You know, has anybody ever done that load testing? You know, there's think CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and test all three. We tend to test for keeping things confidential, but how about integrity? How about preventing stuff getting changed either maliciously or accidentally, files? So there's a lot of testing you can do, and if I'm ranting on about it, it's because I've always been a believer in it, because testing will expose gaps. And I'll give you one statistic that has been around for years, that when you do a data restore, and this is a simple test you can do, or your IT department can do, restore data from last night's backup onto a server. Doesn't have to affect production, but just see, can you restore it? 53% of restores fail. At least that's the figure that had been around for years. I haven't checked it now in the last year, but when I did a year ago, it was still over 50%. You know, so when was the last time you tested a restore? So test. Now, not all tests have to be undertaken by independent parties, but if you're doing a pen test, certain things, they should be independent parties. I mean, a restore should be done by your own people. Hugh referred to classifying issues. If you have an incident, you classify it. Well, if you're testing procedures and incident response procedures, you may go down a detailed route and test the response to a particular incident. And you have to test, I would say you test at least annually, but probably test if you have a major change, let's say an operating system, a major update, a major change in applications. You'll know yourself. If the changes in the environment and the context, you should be retesting. Now, the TLPT, threat-led penetration testing, on live systems critical functions, I think only a small number of you would actually be in scope for that. That is a seriously, I would say, costly and risky test to do, because you're talking about on live systems. I'm not going to go into it today, but it is planned over months, and you have red teams and blue teams and white teams. And the blue team, the defenders, don't know anything about what's coming down the line, or at least they're not supposed to. Include third parties where appropriate. Well, hopefully you do, and don't need to be told this. But if you have an incident, chances are one of your third parties is involved in that. Either it started with them, or they're a critical part of the service you're trying to deliver, and they're an extension of your organization, as I said. Yeah, anything you do, anything you find out in an audit or in an incident, obviously the authorities want to know about it. I say obviously it's in the Act. You have to provide details. So I'll summarize this one, Chris, because I'm watching the time, and say test your plans. I don't know if there's any questions on this from outside.
No, I think we're good on this one. There's a couple of questions in on the simplified regime and who falls in and out of it in terms of the different requirements. So we might address those maybe separately and kind of provide a written response as part of the resources rather than going into the detail there.
Yeah, I think our Article 16 kind of had the simplified response, and that is for a lot of companies. Yeah, if you're I think a lot. Look, we'll do a written response to it, but I think a lot will fall under the simplified one, certainly. Actually, I would have a question maybe for Nina and Hugh. Going through this, I felt that the proportionality principle wasn't as well applied as maybe it could have been. I think a lot of small financial entities were caught with having to provide, I think, disproportionately more information. I mean, what do you guys feel? Do you think the proportionality principle, is that a fair question to ask? Do you think it's evenly applied, or could be better applied?
To be honest, Chris, Jerry, it applied to us in full, so I didn't really think about it.
And can I qualify it by saying, folks, that I think there's nothing in the DORA Act that people shouldn't do. It's all good stuff for everybody's benefit, but I just feel at times it just felt for some of the smaller financial entities, it felt like a lot of work for the size of the company. Yeah.
Well, I suppose, one thing I would say is, when we were looking at the ICT risk framework component, we identified a requirement to have 26 documented processes. So we created 26 risk assessments for our IT department. And Arachas are a very large broker, but you couldn't expect the vast majority of retail intermediaries or insurance intermediaries to have that sort of level of compliance. It's like, you're asking something that you're not going to get.
Okay.
Yeah, Jerry, I think a huge amount of work went into, I suppose, DORA overall. We had a project team set up, and we had 6 separate work streams, and a full huge gap analysis of all the different requirements, etc. And we're still working through. We have, obviously, implemented as at the go live date, etc. But things like contractual arrangements, we're still working through those. I can't speak for the head of VRM, or can't speak for the head of IT, but there's massive amount of work into delivering DORA for the whole of SMT, and it really is like a company-wide initiative to get to where we need to be.
Okay, thanks for that. Final pillar. I'm watching the time. We're kind of going over, but basically information sharing arrangements. It's a wish. It's not a must. There are very few groups where you can share that are organized. But I think if you assume that not everybody knows everything, and by sharing, then we're better off. But all the regulator says is they're encouraging you to join a sharing group where it's trusted among people, and to notify them of your membership. I don't know if there are any comments on that, Chris.
Just the one kind of springs to mind that Jerry and I was asked recently, and maybe it's more to do with the incident management piece around the major threats. Around someone was made the point of why would they tell their competent authority or their supervisor or regulator why would they go and tell them something that they maybe didn't have to tell them? So they probably didn't appreciate the voluntary aspect of it, if that makes sense. So, and I'm not sure yet, does the benefit outweigh the risk, if that makes sense, or the perceived risk of people having to tell the regulator something they maybe don't want to tell them or aren't obliged to tell them, but that may not be the spirit of the pillar, if that makes sense, though, as well.
Okay. Moving on swiftly, because I think we've run out of time, but Chris, I'll leave the final to you.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, look, again, thanks for everyone for joining us this morning. And I think what we want to try and get to, we had focused so much ourselves over the last few months, both in terms of webinars and our own kind of clients as well, and getting the register information over the line. And hopefully what we showed this morning is that the register is thereabouts now, although it will be a cycle. There are unfortunately many more components or pillars under DORA, and I just took 2 screenshots recently from one of the central bank's newsletters, but it could have been from any of the authorities around the EU. So the central bank are saying they're at 99.5% of success rate, basically, for their different submissions for the register information. But the more interesting one that caught my eye in the newsletter, and it actually popped up at our DORA user group meeting last week or the week before when we spoke about the major ICT-related incidents, was that they've actually received approximately 20 submissions since January, so since DORA came into force. So there are people who have, I won't say moved on from the register information, but it is another thing to be conscious of when we do have those major incidents, or if we have those major incidents, that we do have to be conscious of the different regulatory reporting obligations now that have been introduced under DORA. So yeah, Nina, you mentioned the different work streams that happen and things like that. So I can imagine that there's still firms trying to really embed that stuff down now once you get past project and into kind of business as usual. But again, thanks to Nina and Hugh for joining us this morning. If anyone has any questions, you know where to find us, and we'll be in touch with the answers to the different questions that we never got into today, as well as the slides and the recording and things like that as well.
I think a couple of questions have just come in at the end there. But I think we're out of time, Chris. Maybe we can reply to them.
Yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll pop in a kind of a blog or a Q&A section, and just 5 or 6 questions there. And then unfortunately, I think we'll have to kind of cut short here, I think, but we'll come back to everyone later today or early tomorrow morning with the answers to the questions.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Chris. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you, Nina.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Hugh. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.